In the evening of May 11th, 2010, Afriqiyah Airways Flight 771 was a scheduled overnight flight from Johannesburg OR Tambo International Airport in South Africa towards Tripoli in Libya. This was a very familiar route for the involved crew, and on this day it looked like it was going to be flown under mostly clear skies, with an early morning arrival just before the sunrise at their destination. The aircraft used was an Airbus A330, registered as 5 Alpha Oscar November Golf and equipped with 2 General Electric CF6 engines. It had been purchased back in 2009, meaning that it was almost brand new at this point, with less than 600 total flights in its logbook. The only maintenance write-up was a slightly sticky and resistant button on the captain's side stick, specifically the red button that gave priority to the captain's controls, but other than that, the aircraft was in mint condition. Now, planned for the flight this night were 93 passengers plus 8 cabin crew, and up the front, the cockpit was crewed by 3 pilots, which was required for a long overnight flight like this, and with them, this brought the total souls on board to 104. The captain, who was going to operate as pilot monitoring for this leg, was 57 years old, with 17,016 total hours, and out of those, he had accumulated around 500 on the type. He had previously also flown the Fokker 28, the Boeing 727 and the Airbus A320 for various airlines, but had since 2007 been operating as a contract captain for both Afriqiyah Airways and Novel Air, which is an arrangement that I don't think that I've ever seen before. In any case, his first officer, who was going to operate as pilot flying, was 42 years old and had 4,216 total hours, with the same experience on the type as the captain. He had flown on the Twin Otter and the Airbus A320 before, meaning that both of these pilots had quite high experience on Airbus aircraft, and they were also joined by a 37-year-old relief pilot who had only 1,866 hours. Now, all of these pilots had exactly 516 hours on the A330, which is a quirk that can happen at smaller carriers sometimes and could mean that these pilots had actually been rostered together to fly on the same routes. Now, we don't know that for sure, but if that was the case, it could also mean that they had likely developed a deep familiarity with each other and possibly a penchant for assuming intentions and actions, which is worth keeping in mind. Anyway, the preparation for this flight had been very routine, with no major threats identified, so the aircraft soon took off, and by the time it had reached its cruise altitude, the workload in the cockpit dropped down to a quiet, low level. The aircraft soon settled in at 40,000 feet, with its engines humming and everything progressing according to plan, with the pilots monitoring their fuel burn, tracking their progress across successive airspace boundaries, and just following the quiet, repetitive rhythm of long-haul flying. One by one, they then also took their scheduled rest breaks, leaving 2 at a time in the cockpit while the third one slept. And as the night wore on, the captain ended up taking the last rest spot, and he therefore returned to the cockpit just at around the time that the first officer and the relief pilot had started looking at the coming descent. Generally speaking, these type of rests need to be planned to allow the returning pilot at least 30 to 45 minutes of settling back in before any major changes are made, and that's in order to avoid something known as sleep inertia, which is a kind of dazed state that can happen just after you wake up. I'm sure you all recognize it. Now, when we are on the subject of rest, the crew of Flight 771 was perfectly legal to fly. Their accumulated duty times complied with the airline's requirements, and each pilot had also received the mandated rest period before departing from Johannesburg. But it is also worth mentioning that this flight came at the end of 2 consecutive overnight duties, and they were now operating in the most vulnerable part of the human circadian cycle, which occurs in the wee hours just before sunrise. At that time, the alertness, reaction time and decision-making skills are naturally at their lowest, so even though these pilots had gotten some nap time, this was probably still a factor here. Outside, the darkness remained nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional glow of cities far beneath them and the first shade of blue from the approaching dawn. But inside the cockpit, the lighting was dimmed, with the glow from the instrument sharp against the dark panels. And if you've ever been in a cockpit at this time, it is absolutely beautiful and among the most soothing settings that you can ever imagine. Now, as Flight 771 started getting closer to the top of the descent, the pilots started gathering the weather, which looked fine enough. The forecast had talked about some light mists with almost calm winds and possibly some rain later on. And when the pilots received their automatic terminal information service, ATIS, it seemed to perfectly reflect that forecast. Runway 09 was in use with almost calm winds, a visibility of around 8 kilometers in mist with a temperature of 22 degrees and a local pressure of 1008 hectopascals. A perfectly lovely morning. So when the pilots initiated their descent, everything likely felt very comfortable and predictable. The long cruise segment was over and the pilots now started to put their seats back into position in preparation for the coming approach and landing. And as I mentioned earlier, Tripoli was a very familiar destination for these three pilots. It was the home base for the airline, and that familiarity now shaped the preparations as they were getting closer to the airport. Familiarity is often a good thing, since it draws down stress and often comes with loads of extra knowledge that isn't always publicly available. But it can also cause complacency, which is where you're not taking adequate care because you're just so familiar. This is something that doesn't just happen in aviation, by the way. Most of us are experiencing it in a lot of different areas in our lives, not least with how we handle our personal digital data. How often do you think twice about entering things like your email, birth date and credit card information when you're out web shopping, for example, or signing up for a new website or service? Well, there are a lot of bad actors out there who take advantage of this. Plus, your data often leaks out through data breaches. And once it's out, there is a whole marketplace with legal data brokers who then package you up and sells your information to the highest bidders like banks, insurance companies and even criminals. That's why I trust today's sponsor, Incogni, to help me set things right and remove my data from these companies. Once you sign up with Incogni, they will start searching for your data all over the internet, and when they come across a site that sells it, they will force the broker to remove it. You don't have to lift a finger. They've also recently added a customs removal feature where if you find a specific website selling your data, you can submit the link directly to Incogni and their team will handle the rest. For me, the biggest change has been the dramatic drop in spam calls and suspicious emails. When I signed up, Incogni found my data on over 220 sites, and they have now been removing them all one by one. So right now, you can get 60% off their annual plan if you sign up using this QR code or by going to incogni.com/pilot and use the code PILOT. Thank you so much, Incogni. Now let's get back to the video. At time 0529, the air traffic controller issued them with an initial approach clearance for runway 09, which was in line with the 80s that they had just received. And with no significant weather changes expected, there was no reason for the crew to expect anything else, so they just acknowledged the runway and continued down. The approach available for runway 09 that morning was something known as a locator or NDB non-precision approach. There was normally also a VR approach available with a slightly higher precision, but the VR beacon was restricted on this day due to some equipment moving around it. Now there was also a precision approach, an ILS approach available from the other runway, but since runway 09 was now active, that was not really an option. What this meant was that the crew would now have to fly a procedure that lacked horizontal electronic guidance and therefore would require them to manage the descent with a little bit more effort. That wasn't ideal, but the pilots were well familiar with it, and over the relatively flat terrain of northern Libya, it shouldn't cause any issues at all. The approach briefing that the first officer eventually held really showed that familiarity, which I will soon get back to. But before I get to that, it's worth looking at the various ways that this approach could be flown. You see, on the Airbus A330, there is more than one way to fly a non-precision approach, and the choice matters. A crew could either decide to fly the approach manually using the side stick and throttles freely whilst tracking raw data navigation. Now that would obviously demand constant attention, but would also allow the pilots to be directly engaged with the aircraft's flight path. But they could also use the autopilot's selected modes, in which the autopilot would follow pilot commanded values, like a chosen vertical speed or flight path angle, and this would still require the crew to actively manage each step of their descent, but would also give them full control. And finally, they could use something known as managed guidance, where the flight management system would be allowed to calculate a continuous descent profile and then follow that whilst adjusting pitch automatically to place the aircraft at the correct altitude over the correct points all the way down to the minimum descent altitude. The manage modes could be used after verifying that all needed values were available and correctly coded in the flight management system, and using that would greatly reduce the workload, which was why it was often preferred. But of course, it obviously still required constant monitoring. Now, all three of these methods were obviously safe if flown correctly, but only if everyone in the cockpit agreed on which to be used. And the way to make sure that that was the case was by going through a thorough approach briefing. Now, in most airlines, that's something that would be done well before the initial descent, in order to allow everyone to pay maximum attention with minimum distractions. And any approach briefing will need to include descent data like expected winds, the standard arrival or STAR to be used, as well as a full review of the approach charts, including frequencies, procedures, courses, altitudes, minimas, as well as the missed approach profile and altitudes. This is also where we will calculate and verify the landing distance with the latest weather and runway conditions, and then follow that up with a thorough taxi briefing. But in the case of a non-precision approach, we also tend to do a more detailed and deeper briefing. There we would typically outline exactly what modes we are planning to use, when we will configure the different flap steps, gear and do the checklist, and basically tell a story about how the approach is supposed to be flown. In my company, that's known as a double briefing, and the reason it is so effective and important is that it prepares the involved pilots for exactly what's about to happen, so any deviations can be clearly called out. Since there are more potential for mistakes and omissions during a non-precision approach, this briefing step is crucial. But unfortunately, nothing like that was done on board Flight 771. Instead, the pilots now just continued their descent down towards runway 09 without any real detailed or structured briefing at all, until they were only about 10 nautical miles away from the runway and at an altitude of 1800 feet. At that point, they were approaching the Tango Whiskey Beacon, which was the final approach point and the nav aid on which the whole approach was built. And it was only there, with just minutes left to go, that the first officer did a version of a compressed briefing. He now stated that he would be using runway 09 with a non-precision locator approach, and that they would be using outer brake low as the runway was 3,600 meters long. But there was never any discussion about how the approach would be flown or what automation modes he would be using, and that was even though his company's SOPs clearly outlined the need for that. And this, my friends, was where my blood started to boil when I was reading this report. You see, standard operating procedures exist for a reason, and just skipping them will maybe work sometimes, but it will always erode the margins built into the operations. Margins that serve a purpose. Each omitted detail removes a layer of protection and makes the flight more dependent on everything unfolding exactly as the pilots expected it to do, which it rarely does. Now, I know that they were returning home to their home base, and a lot of crews will shorten their briefings there, but that's only something that you can do when there is no question about how you will be flying your approach, like when you're doing an ILS, for example. But on a non-precision approach with several ways of handling it, a briefing just has to be done for reasons that will soon become very clear. Anyway, once this short briefing had been completed, the pilots received their final vector from the controller and soon rolled out on a heading of roughly 089 degrees, lining up nicely with the extended center line of runway 09. They were now less than 10 nautical miles away from the runway, in calm air and with the runway straight ahead on their navigation displays, but not yet in sight. Now, like I mentioned before, the locator approach into runway 09 revolved around a single critical point, the Tango Whiskey NDB beacon. It served both as the initial approach fix, if a full procedure would be flown, and the final approach fix, which needed to be reached before the aircraft could execute its final descent down towards the minimum descent altitude. Tango Whiskey sat 5.2 nautical miles away from the VOR NDB, but only 3.9 nautical miles from the runway threshold, and from there the descent profile was pretty straightforward. Aircraft approaching from the east were expected to maintain 2,000 feet if they were doing a full procedure, initial outbound turn from the Tango Whiskey, and then when turning inbound to heading 089, they could step down to 1,400 feet, which was the lowest altitude they were allowed to maintain until reaching the beacon. Now, that initial leg of 2,000 feet could be replaced by a radar vector instead, which is why Flight 771 was only keeping 1,800 feet when they turned final. But it was still only after passing the Tango Whiskey that the aircraft could descend lower, down to the minimum descent altitude, or MDA, of 620 feet. Now, just to make things even more complicated here, there were a few different ways that the descent after Tango Whiskey could be accomplished, all of whom were legal but varying in their efficiency. One way would be to use the managed mode that I explained before, and with that the FMC would calculate a final descent path based on a starting altitude 50 feet over the threshold and then building that backwards using a 3-degree glide path up to 1,400 feet. But since Tango Whiskey was 3.9 miles away from the runway, this would mean that the aircraft would have to maintain 1,400 feet for a while after passing Tango Whiskey, and then start following that 3-degree path down towards the MDA. Then, if after reaching the MDA the aircraft would not have any visual contact with the runway, an immediate missed approach would have to be flown, similar to what would happen on an ILS approach after reaching the minima. The second, and slightly more complicated way of flying, would be to maintain 1,400 feet and then select a constant descent angle about 1 nautical mile before crossing the Tango Whiskey, and that would arm the manually selected mode. But the aircraft wouldn't start descending until the selected knob was pulled out, which should be done about 0.2 miles before passing Tango Whiskey to enable the descent to be started exactly at the passage. That constant angle would then be manually adjusted to try and reach the MDA at a similar point as the previously managed procedure. But if the adjusted MDA would be reached earlier, well, then the aircraft could be flown level for a while until either a safe landing could be done or until the missed approach point, located at another locator called Delta, was reached. Latest there, a go-around had to be initiated. Finally, an old-fashioned dive and drive technique could be used, where the aircraft would just descend down to an adjusted MDA immediately after passing the Tango Whiskey and then maintain level flight until either a landing could be done or the missed approach point would be reached. But that wasn't a technique that modern airliners would typically use, so we are going to focus on the first two here instead. As Flight 771 settled onto the final, the lack of a formal briefing started to have its obvious effects. The autopilot still remained engaged, tracking the lateral path cleanly, when the captain suddenly made a brief comment about how he wanted the approach to be flown. Let us do it. What is the name? It is better. Nav approach. It is approved, as you know. By this, he likely meant that he wanted a managed approach, letting the flight management system calculate and fly the descent profile automatically, but the way that he expressed this was highly non-standard and left quite some room for interpretation to his colleague. Nevertheless, the first officer seemed to pick up what the captain meant and just said, yeah, okay. So at this point, they both seemed to share a common view of what was about to happen, as the controller now called them up and cleared them for the locator approach for runway 09. By that time, 03:57 and 50 seconds, the captain suddenly also called out, track FPA, from out of nowhere. This was likely just a call to indicate that he now saw the bird on his primary flight display. The bird is the speed and flight path vector, which shows what the aircraft is actually doing as opposed to just heading and attitude. Now, it was normal procedure to always have the bird activated, especially for non-precision approaches. But again, calling track FPA was also non-standard. And since track FPA was also how the selected modes were sometimes referred to, this could have given the first officer the impression that the captain now wanted to change the plans. Instead of flying a fully managed approach, he maybe now wanted him to use selected modes instead, meaning a lower form of automation. So the first officer therefore responded, "Established. Let's say now, okay?" Since the aircraft was at this point lined up laterally with the final approach track, and he then continued with, "I will do it when established." Now, in a functioning cockpit, these kind of assumptions just shouldn't happen. The approach briefing would have made it clear what strategy to follow, and any changes to that would have led to a discussion to clarify. But none of that was happening now. And as a result, the two pilots' understanding of what they were now about to do had slightly started to diverge. The crew continued configuring the aircraft to config 2. And at time 03:58 and 46 seconds, the captain called out, "Give it to the approach now," in Arabic. And that likely meant that he now wanted the first officer to engage the approach mode for the managed approach. At this point, the aircraft was about 7 nautical miles out and maintaining 1400 feet, which, remember, was the minimum altitude until reaching Tango Whiskey. And the first officer responded to the captain's call by indeed arming the approach mode and then verifying it on his flight mode annunciator, the FMA. And this meant that the aircraft now really was prepared for the managed approach, but that doubt that the first officer had about the captain's intentions likely still lingered in his mind. In any case, this was followed up by him calling for the flaps to be moved to position 3 and the landing configuration to be completed, and after that he also called for the landing checklist. But just as the captain was about to start going through it, he was interrupted by a call from the tower, who told them to continue approach and call when you have the runway in sight. And now, something very strange happened. At time 03:59 and 24 seconds, a flight path angle of -3 degrees was suddenly selected on the FCU, and the autopilot initiated a descent in the flight path angle mode, overriding the armed approach mode. This happened as the captain was still busy responding to the tower, and it meant that the final descent now started before the aircraft had reached the Tango Whiskey locator. It is hard to know why the first officer did this, but maybe he now had in his mind that he needed to fly the approach in a selected mode, and had therefore pre-selected the flight path angle he wanted, and maybe then just pulled the knob by mistake. Remember, if flown that way, the flight path angle should have been set 1 nautical mile before crossing the beacon and then activated 0.2 miles before, but now happened all together instead. It's also a possibility that the first officer misinterpreted the distance shown on the FMC progress page of 5.2 nautical miles to the runway as the DME distance of 5.2 miles to the VOR, which is where Tango Whiskey was located. But in any case, this meant that the aircraft was now descending way too early, and no one seemed to realize this. So, what was the captain actually doing then? Well, like I said before, he was talking to air traffic control, but that didn't mean that he was absolved from his pilot monitoring duties. In fact, even as this mistake was being made, he could have easily held off on the radio conversation to point that error out. But since that didn't happen, it's more likely that he just wasn't paying full attention to the flight path. Or maybe, if he looked down, he would have recognized the -3 degrees flight path angle from previous approaches that he had flown and therefore didn't question it further. But I just want to stop here and point something out. This is actually an excellent example of why open and clear communication is so important. Not only could this have been avoided by a full approach briefing, but any of these assumptions made by both pilots could easily have been cleared out if they had used accurate callouts, thought of questioning each other's actions, and maintained good situational awareness. But since none of that happened here, this approach just continued, with the captain clearly not paying attention to what was going on. Once the descent had been initiated, the first officer soon called out the "go around altitude" and -3 degrees, sir, showing that he had now reset the target altitude to the published missed approach altitude and that he was descending at a 3 degrees glide path. That provided a great chance for the captain to maybe question the selection, but after having responded 2000 set, verifying the correct altitude, he was now again interrupted by a radio call, this time from a captain of a different aircraft that had just landed ahead of them. That captain had earlier recognized the captain's voice and now called him up by his name to warn him that the visibility on the ground was much worse than reported and that there was low stratus or fog clouds near the runway. Now this call likely had a dual effect. First, the captain probably listened more intently to it since his name was being used, which might be why he missed the first officer's call about the descent angle. And secondly, it likely diverted his mind and attention towards the weather outside and therefore even further away from his instruments and the aircraft's position. And since he didn't respond to parts of the first officer's call, the first officer assumed that the captain agreed with this new course of action. Again, more assumptions. A few seconds later, the first officer called out that they were now crossing the Tango Whiskey, but without highlighting that they were only at 1020 feet, significantly below the published minimum crossing altitude of 1350 feet. And this was not picked up by anyone. Now, the fact that none of the pilots, nor the relief pilot on the jump seat in the back, reacted to this is quite hard to explain, but again, it just points back to them lacking a proper approach briefing. In any case, it's likely that the captain, who was now worrying more about the weather, used the first officer's crossing call as a reminder to check in for a landing clearance. Because he now called up the tower and asked if they were clear to land, if the runway was in sight, to which the tower confirmed that they were. The aircraft continued descending on its now very low profile, but that in itself was not actually such a big deal. There were no big obstacles below them, so as long as they didn't bust the MDA, the only real effect that this would have would be that they would reach their MDA much earlier than expected, which, in this relatively poor visibility, would mean that they wouldn't see anything and would have to go around. But never underestimate the startle effect. At time 04 and 24 seconds, the aircraft automatically called out that it was 100 above the set MDA of 620 feet. The first officer now asked in Arabic, "Can you see it?" And the captain just responded, "Continue," to which the first officer called back the very same words. The captain was now likely looking outside and fully expecting to see the runway appear straight ahead at any second. Remember, he still thought that they were flying a fully managed approach and should therefore break out in the perfect position to land. But where they now were, more than 2 miles ahead of the runway, if they would be able to see the approach light at all, they would appear much further ahead than where he was looking. 6 seconds later, the aircraft reached the MDA and then just kept descending. And another 6 seconds later, the first officer, who clearly still couldn't see the runway, asked the captain if he should continue. Again, it's worth pointing out here that if no visual contact is established at or before the minimums, that question should just never come. A go-around must be flown, but this cockpit was clearly not functioning as designed. Another few seconds passed with the aircraft still descending into the mist, but as it descended through 280 feet above the ground proximity EGPWS system recognized that it wasn't where it was supposed to be and now called out a loud "Too low terrain" warning. The captain became very surprised by this and therefore shouted out, "Go around! Go around! Go around!" which caused the first officer to immediately disconnect the autopilot, push the thrust levels into the toga detent and then start pitching up. So far, so good. Except for disconnecting the autopilot, this was what would be expected in a situation like this, but to really understand what was about to happen, it's important to point out that this was not the first time that this crew had botched this particular approach. Just a few weeks earlier, on April 28th, these same two pilots had found themselves in almost exactly the same position, flying the same Airbus on the same approach in similarly marginal visibility. In that case, the descent had also begun too early, and the aircraft had drifted below its intended vertical profile and become unstabilized. And when they finally realized that, they had also executed a go-around. But crucially, during that maneuver, they had then accidentally let their speed get too high, which had triggered a flap overspeed warning. Now, they eventually sorted that out, climbing away without further issues, and the situation resolved without anything else happening. But the first officer had been rattled by the overspeed warning, which is worth keeping in mind here. Also, after that approach, the crew had never filed a report, which meant that there was no evidence that the unstable approach had ever happened, and therefore no chance that it would be escalated within the airline, leading to a debrief of the crew. And without that conversation, no lessons could be learned from it either. In aviation, near misses and mistakes are often useful safety events, but only if they are recognized as such and debriefed in a structured way. So conversely, if an event ends safely but is never examined, it can quietly reshape the pilot's expectations, which brings us back to Flight 771, which was now spooling up its engines and preparing for this new go-around. The first officer had, like I mentioned, reacted immediately to the captain's commands, snapping into the go-around memory items the way that he had been trained to do. He advanced the thrusts to toga, disconnected the autopilot and pitched the nose upwards towards an initial attitude of 12.3 degrees, and then asked for go-around flaps to be selected and the gear to be retracted, exactly as could be expected. But now another strange thing happened. After the aircraft had climbed a bit, reaching an altitude of 670 feet, the pitch-up inputs from the first officer's side stick suddenly changed to a pitch-down input instead. And this was then maintained for a full 21 seconds. During that time, the pitch changed from the initial almost 13 degrees pitch up to a negative 3.5 degrees, and since the engines were still producing go-around thrust, this also came with a rapid acceleration. So, what was going on here? Well, I have in several of my previous videos talked about the insidious nature of a phenomenon known as somatographic illusion. This is something that can happen to pilots who are subjected to both a pitch up and a sudden powerful acceleration without access to enough visual references. You see, the balance organs in our inner ears are not equipped to sense the difference between a pitch up and an acceleration. So the only way that we can know what is by using our eyes as judges and then react according to what they tell us. That's actually exactly what we instructors use inside of full motion flight simulators when we simulate acceleration or deceleration. If you look at the simulator outside when we're taking off, you will see it gradually pitching more and more up. But since the picture that the pilots are seeing inside is of a runway they are accelerating down, their inner ears and eyes will tell their brain that they are indeed only accelerating. Very neat, but potentially deadly when encountered in reality. So why is that then? Well, let's say that you are the first officer in this scenario who have just executed the go-around and is now pitching up to climb. At the same time, you have also pushed the thrust levels forward, which will accelerate the aircraft to enable the flaps to be retracted. Now, if you are monitoring your instruments while this is happening, your brain will be able to understand that you are both pitching and accelerating, because you can see it on your instruments. But if you're not paying attention, or you're focusing too much on one single instrument or something else, well, then your inner ear might add the two feelings together and interpret it as a much higher pitch up instead. And that's likely exactly what now happened inside of this cockpit. For one reason or another, the first officer thought that he was pitching up too much and therefore tried to counteract that by pushing his side stick forward. On top of this, even though it was the captain who had called for the missed approach, he had likely become very startled by the sudden terrain warning, so his slightly panicked go-around call might have been more of a backbone reaction than a conscious thought. That in turn meant that he now had fallen behind the aircraft and therefore didn't make his normal calls as he should as pilot monitoring. For example, he didn't call out positive rate, which the first officer questioned him on, and he also didn't call out the FMA readouts as he should. So there is a possibility here that it was his passiveness that caused the first officer to look away from his instruments and pay more attention to him instead, leading to the illusion. In any case, the result was now a descending aircraft that was accelerating even faster, which probably increased the first officer's pitch-up illusion even more. Now the captain should have been able to snap back into his senses relatively quickly here, but the problem was that he was now suffering from that very same illusion. And we know that because inputs on his side stick were now recorded also pitching down and basically mirroring the first officer's. And that's even though he definitely shouldn't have been inputting at all, since he wasn't flying. Under normal circumstances, his inputs would have triggered a dual input warning in this case, but since the inputs were largely mirroring the first officer's, the difference was too small to trigger that warning. Anyway, as this was happening, the first officer did still continue to try and manage the aircraft. He now called for the flaps to be retracted further, which was likely because he now saw the speed rapidly approaching the maximum flap speed, and he remembered the last go-around they had done when they had busted that speed twice, something that he now desperately wanted to avoid. And that focus on the speed might be another reason for him not monitoring his artificial horizon, which would have clearly showed them pitching down, not to mention his flight directors, who would have shown that a steep pitch up was really needed. In any case, the captain did respond to the first officer's flap call and retracted the flaps from config 2 to 1, but instead of then trying to get his head around what was happening to his aircraft, he now decided to contact the tower controller instead to inform him about the go-around. Now, anyone who has been following this channel for a while will remember the golden rule of aviation. Aviate, navigate, communicate, in that order. And this is an excellent example of why that is so important. There should just be no communication with outside sources unless the aircraft is flying safely first, which was now clearly not happening. Simultaneously, the captain now also noticed the high acceleration trend on his primary flight display and therefore called out "Speed!", which was actually his first really useful input as pilot monitoring, even though it was obviously not the most pressing issue here. But instead of correlating that acceleration with their descent, he now reached over and pulled out the Speed Mac button to try and get the auto throttle to reduce the speed for them. But that didn't work, since the thrust levels were still in the toga detent. And again, it wasn't his role to do that either, since he was the pilot monitoring and not the pilot flying. If he wanted to do something like that, he needed to take controls. But another question is, what was the GPWS system doing at this point? I mean, it had been what triggered the go-around in the first place, and they were now approaching the ground again, so shouldn't it reactivate? And the answer to that is yes, of course it would. About 3 seconds after the captain had pulled out the speed selector, the EGPWS again started shouting, "Don't sink," followed by "Too low, terrain." And the first officer actually responded to this by pulling back on his side stick. But at the same time, he also called out "Active approach phase," which made no sense and actually indicated that he maybe was mentally getting ready to start another approach, instead of trying to keep the aircraft away from striking the ground, showing just how much he had now lost his situational awareness. And at the same time as he was now pitching up, the captain started pushing his side stick sharply forward instead, whilst also pressing his priority button for 3 seconds, effectively taking control of the flight, while still in the grip of a powerful somatographic illusion. Now, he didn't make any call out about taking control, so maybe this was an unconscious movement, or he pressed the priority button by mistake when he wanted to push that radio transmit button instead. And remember, it had been recorded as being a bit sticky. But in any case, this should have triggered a priority left automatic call out in the cockpit, but unfortunately that had a lower priority than the EGPWS warnings, so it never sounded. And what all of this meant was that the aircraft now kept pitching forward, and it then kept descending until it was only 180 feet above the ground, when the captain suddenly started pulling back on his stick, just like the first officer, maybe finally realizing what was about to happen. but he only did so for a second before pitching forward again, finally sealing the fate of almost everyone on board. At time 04:01 and 13 seconds, Flight 771 struck the ground in a mostly wings level attitude and with the gears retracted, about 1,200 meters before the threshold of runway 09. The speed at impact was high enough to completely destroy the aircraft, leaving a trail of metal and debris for over 800 meters before everything fell silent again. And the crew on board an Alitalia aircraft on the taxiway had actually seen the impact from a distance, with a flash briefly illuminating the early morning darkness. Of the 104 people on board, 103 lost their lives, but one passenger, a 9-year-old child, survived with serious injuries. A fact that would later underscore both the violence of the impacts and the randomness of survival from accidents like this. In the immediate aftermath, the scene at Tripoli International Airport was one of confusion and shock. Rescue vehicles reached the wreckage within minutes, but the scale of destruction left little doubt about the final outcome. Investigators quickly found a tightly interlocked chain of human factors that contributed to this: fatigue during the circadian low, an incomplete approach briefing, unspoken assumptions about automation, degraded crew coordination, and a late go-around executed under stress. Each element on its own survivable, but together deadly. In response to this, Afriqiyah Airways and the regulators implemented some swift changes. The airline revised its standard operating procedures to require structured approach briefings for all non-precision approaches, including mandatory discussions about automation modes and go-around plans. Crew resource management training was overhauled to emphasize assertive decision-making, unambiguous call-outs, and positive transfer of controls. Go-around training was expanded with specific focus on low-altitude, high-thrust scenarios and spatial disorientation. But more broadly, this accident reinforced lessons that resonate across all of modern aviation. Automation doesn't remove responsibility, it just changes where vigilance must be applied. Experience doesn't guarantee safety if it replaces discipline, and near misses will only serve a purpose if they are recognized, reported, and followed up. Now, if I have any say in things, these are the real lessons that you pilots out there should take with you from this horrible story. This is a less known accident, but one which holds a lot of valuable lessons, and my team and I are continuously looking for these kinds of learning moments in order to improve the general understanding about aviation safety and hopefully also to add to it. Now, if you want to support that mission, then please scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. That will also give you exclusive early access to all of my videos. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.